For 11 years, the envelope sat at the bottom of her dresser drawer, under a folded blue cardigan and a photograph she no longer looked at. Her name was written on the front in someone else's handwriting. She never opened it. Not because she forgot, because some things you leave alone. That same morning, a woman she had never once worked beside handed her a check and said, "We so appreciate everything you've done for this family." 22 years. Dorothy Haynes took the check. She said, "Thank you." She walked out. That night, she pulled open the bottom drawer. The old paper was cool and slightly soft against her fingers. She set the envelope on the kitchen table and looked at it for a long time. She had forgotten what was inside. The Hargrove family had not. The morning it ended was a Friday in March. Dorothy had been up since 5, the way she always was. Old habit. 22 years of arriving before the house woke up had settled into her body like weather. She didn't need an alarm anymore. She made coffee in her own kitchen, drank it standing by the window, then drove the 12 miles to the Hargrove property the same way she had driven it 1,000 times before. Past the grain elevator, past the white church with the crooked steeple, down the long county road where the fence posts leaned slightly east from decades of the same wind. She had kept working after Mr. Hargrove passed, 8 months ago now. The family had asked her to stay on, or rather, no one had asked her to leave, which in that house amounted to the same thing. So she stayed. She tended the West Field the way she always had. She pruned the roses in October. She showed the new yard man where the irrigation lines ran. She did what needed doing, because that was what she did. It did not occur to her that staying on was also making herself easier to let go. The kitchen smelled like coffee and lemon soap when she came in through the side door. His daughter-in-law was already at the table, dressed, composed, a sealed envelope set in front of the empty chair across from her. Not the chair where Mr. Hargrove used to sit. The other one. "Dorothy." She gestured toward the chair. "Please, sit down." Dorothy sat. The envelope was pushed across the table. Inside was a check. 3 months' salary, precise and clean. Dorothy did not look at the number. She felt the weight of the paper, heard the faint sound the woman's pen had made signing it, and understood everything she needed to understand. "We so appreciate everything you've done for this family," the woman said. She was looking slightly past Dorothy's shoulder when she said it. Not at the window. Not at anything in particular. Just past. 22 years. And she shook Dorothy's hand the way you shake the hand of someone you've just been introduced to at a dinner party. Dorothy took the check. She said thank you. She meant neither. She drove home the long way without deciding to. Past the Hargrove property. The West Field ran along the road for nearly a quarter mile. 40 acres of land she had turned and tended and learned season by season without ever thinking of it as anything other than her work. She didn't slow down, but she looked. Her house was quiet when she got home. It was always quiet. She stood in the front room for a moment, her coat still on, her keys still in her hand. Then she walked to the bedroom and crouched in front of the old oak dresser, the one that had been her mother's, and her mother's mother's before that, and pulled open the bottom drawer. She moved the blue cardigan aside. She moved the photograph she no longer looked at. And there it was, the envelope, cream-colored, slightly yellowed at the edges. Her name on the front, Dorothy Haynes, in the careful, unhurried handwriting of a man who had been dead for 8 months. She picked it up. She had not held it in 11 years. It was lighter than she remembered. Or maybe she was just different now. Older, quieter, less certain about what things were supposed to weigh. She carried it to the kitchen and set it on the table under the overhead light. Then she sat down and looked at it the way you look at something you're not sure you're ready to know. She didn't open it that night, but she didn't put it back either. She had not planned to stay 22 years. No one plans that. When Dorothy Haynes answered the ad, a small card pinned to the bulletin board at the laundromat on Route 11, groundskeeper and property maintenance, experience preferred. She was 43 years old and had been a widow for 4 months. Her husband Roy had gone quietly, the way some men do, a heart that simply stopped one Tuesday morning while he was lacing his work boots. No warning, no time to prepare. Just the boots on the floor and the silence after. She had no savings to speak of. Roy had worked, and she had worked, and somehow there had never been enough left over to put anywhere. So when the laundromat card appeared, she called the number. She told herself it was temporary, something to get through the winter. The Hargrove property was 12 miles outside of town. The main house was the kind of place that expected you to notice it. Dorothy noticed it. But what made her stay wasn't the house. It was the West Field, 40 acres of land that had been neglected long enough to become honest again. She started clearing it the third week without being asked. Nobody told her to stop. Robert Hargrove was not an easy man. She understood that within the first month. He was in his late 60s when she arrived, sharp-minded, impatient, the kind of man who had strong opinions about how things should be done and limited interest in explaining why. He had built the family's land holdings over 40 years through a combination of intelligence and stubbornness, and the stubbornness had outlasted some of the intelligence by the time Dorothy came to work for him. His children, 2 sons and a daughter, all grown, all living elsewhere, visited on holidays and left quickly. Dorothy noticed that too. He was hard on them the way certain fathers are hard. Not cruel, but withholding. She watched his children try to reach him over the years, and watched them eventually stop trying. But he was never that way with her. With Dorothy, he was formal, almost old-fashioned. He called her Mrs. Haynes, always, even after a decade, even when they were the only 2 people on the property and there was no one to be formal for. She had worked for people who used her first name like it was permission for something. The way Mr. Hargrove said Mrs. Haynes was different. It had a weight to it, a boundary that was also, she came to understand, a kind of respect. He was still not easy. She needed to be clear about that. The first spring, she made a mistake with the rose bed along the south wall, pruned the old climbing roses back hard, the way she'd been taught, the way most people would. She came in the next morning to find him standing in front of the bed, not speaking. He looked at the cut canes for a long moment. Then he looked at her. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. "These were my grandfather's roses," he said. "They don't cut back the same way." That evening, she found a slip of paper tucked under the door of the equipment shed. Folded once. She unfolded it. "My grandfather planted those roses that way. I should have told you before. No apology. No, I'm sorry I made you feel bad or I shouldn't have spoken sharply. Just the facts of the situation, laid out plainly, with the quiet acknowledgement that part of the fault was his." She stood in the doorway of the shed and read it twice. Then she folded it back up and put it in her coat pocket and went home. She had worked for people her whole life. She had never received a note like that from any of them. She stayed. The November she turned 54, her daughter forgot to call on her birthday. She remembered the date specifically later, not because of the birthday, but because of what happened that evening in the garden. It was the kind of detail the mind pins things to, a small private hurt that becomes a marker for something larger. She had been working late, securing the climbing rose on the east trellis, before the first hard frost came in. The temperature had dropped fast that afternoon, the way it does in the Virginia hills in November, the cold arriving without much ceremony. Her breath showed in the air. The ground under her boots was beginning to firm. She heard the cars before she saw them. Two of them, coming up the drive, parking near the house. The children, all three, which was unusual. They didn't often come together outside of Christmas. She could hear voices through the kitchen window, which she had no intention of going near. Whatever was being said in that kitchen was not her business. She kept working. An hour later, the cars left. She heard the engines turn over, heard the gravel under the tires, and then the quiet came back. The particular quiet of a property after people have argued and gone. She was tying off the last section of vine when she heard the side door open. Mr. Hargrove came across the yard slowly. He was wearing his coat, but hadn't buttoned it, which meant he had come out without fully deciding to. He was carrying a glass of bourbon. She could smell it from a few feet away. But when he stopped beside her, she saw that he hadn't drunk any of it. He was just holding it. He stood there for a moment, looking at the rose vine. Then he reached into his coat and took out an envelope. Cream-colored. Sealed. Her name on the front in his handwriting. The careful, deliberate script of a man who had learned to write when penmanship still meant something. He held it out. She took it. "Put this somewhere," he said. "Don't tell anyone." A pause. Especially not them. She knew who he meant. She had always known. That was the other thing about working for a family for 22 years. You learn the weight of every silence, and you learn which silences belong to which people. And you learn that them said in that particular tone, by a man standing alone in a dark garden after his children have just driven away, means something specific and settled and sad. She didn't ask what was inside. He didn't offer. The frost was coming in hard now. She had 3 more ties to finish. Behind her, she heard him go back inside. She worked until the vine was secured. Then she gathered her tools and walked to the equipment shed and locked up for the night. The envelope sat in her coat pocket the whole time, light as paper, heavy as everything she didn't know yet. She never asked what was inside. That was the kind of woman she was, and that, as it turned out, was exactly the reason he had chosen her. She made coffee first. That was the kind of woman Dorothy Haynes was. She made coffee before she opened things that might change her life. The envelope had sat on the kitchen table all night. She had not moved it before going to bed. She had not moved it when she got up at 5 the way she always did, old habit now unmoored from any purpose. She simply walked around it, filled the kettle, stood at the window while the coffee brewed, and watched the light come up slow and gray over the backyard. Then she sat down across from it, the cream-colored envelope, her name in his handwriting. 11 years in the bottom of a drawer, and now here it was under the kitchen light, looking like nothing in particular. She almost put it back. The thought came clearly, without drama. Put it in the drawer and leave it there. She was 65 years old. She had no job now and a small savings account and a house that was paid for, which was more than a lot of people had. The envelope had waited 11 years. It could wait longer. Whatever was inside had not hurt her yet by staying unknown, and there was something to be said for that. But then she looked at her name on the front, Dorothy Haynes. The letters careful and unhurried, the way he wrote everything. He had been gone 8 months. He would not write her name again. She picked up the envelope and opened it. Inside were 3 things. The first was a single sheet of paper, a notarial certificate, typed, dated November 14th, 11 years ago. She recognized the format from the closing paperwork on her house, years back. Official. Signed. A notary's embossed seal pressed into the lower corner. The second was heavier. Several pages, folded together. She unfolded them carefully and smoothed them flat against the table. It was a legal document, typed on formal paper, the kind with the double border around the edge. At the top, amendment to last will and testament of Robert Edward Hargrove. Below that, a paragraph she had to read twice before the words stopped rearranging themselves. Then a third line, partway down the first page, where a name appeared. Dorothy Ann Haynes. She read it once, then again. Then a third time, slower, the way you read something when you're hoping the words will change. They didn't change. 40 acres. Her name. Not a mistake. There was a notary seal, a witness signature, a date. 11 years ago, a man she had worked for had quietly, legally given her something, and she had been carrying it at the bottom of a drawer ever since, not knowing. She set the pages down. She stood up, went to the sink, and washed the coffee cup. The water was warmer than she expected. Her hands moved through the familiar motions. Rinse, soap, rinse again, while somewhere behind her, the papers sat on the table waiting. She turned off the tap, set the cup upside down on the dish rack, stood looking at the faucet for a moment, with her hands braced on the edge of the sink. Then she dried her hands on the dish towel and sat back down. The West Field. She had worked that land for 22 years. She knew where the soil went soft after rain and where it stayed firm. She knew which corner flooded in a wet spring and which row of old fence posts had started leaning and needed replacing. She had cleared it, turned it, planted it, left certain parts of it alone because they were better left alone. She had never thought of it as anything other than her work. It had been hers. It had been hers for 11 years, and she hadn't known. She sat with that for a long time. Then she noticed the third thing. It had slipped to the side when she'd unfolded the will amendment. A smaller piece of paper, not typed, not official looking. A plain white note card folded once. She picked it up and opened it. One line written in his hand. The survey is already done. The water is real. Dorothy read it again. She turned the card over. Nothing on the back. No signature. No date, no explanation. The survey is already done. The water is real. She had no idea what it meant. The West Field had a spring that ran along the northern edge. She knew that. She had worked around it for years. But a survey. Water. The phrasing had a weight to it that she couldn't account for. The particular weight of a sentence written by someone who knew more than they were saying. She set the card down next to the will amendment. Outside the kitchen window, the yard was fully light now. The February sky, the pale, washed-out blue that comes after a cold night. A cardinal landed on the fence post at the edge of the property and sat there for a moment, very red against the gray wood, and then was gone. Dorothy looked at the note card for a long time. The water is real. She didn't know what that meant, but somewhere across town, in a house with 12 rooms and a name older than the county, someone did. She didn't know any lawyers, not the kind she needed now. There was Ed Patterson, who had handled the paperwork when she and Roy bought the house 30 years ago. A quiet man with a downtown office and a habit of speaking slowly, as though every word cost something. She still had his number written in the address book she kept in the kitchen drawer. She called him the morning after she opened the envelope, standing at the counter with the will amendment spread flat in front of her. She read him the relevant parts over the phone. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, There was a pause long enough that she thought the line had dropped. "Dorothy," he said finally, "I do wills and closings. What you're describing, contested estate, property dispute with the Hargroves, that's a different kind of work." Another pause. "Let me give you a name." The name was James Whitfield. Patterson said he was young but careful, which was the combination she needed more than anything else right now. Whitfield's office was on the second floor of a building on Court Street, above a pharmacy that had been there since Dorothy was a girl. The stairs were narrow. The door at the top had his name on it in stick-on letters, one of them slightly crooked. Inside, 2 rooms, a waiting area with 3 chairs and a water-stained ceiling tile, and his office where a box fan on the desk pushed warm air around without cooling anything. He was 34, maybe 35, young enough that Dorothy felt the gap between them like a change in temperature. He stood up when she came in, which she noted, and he shook her hand and gestured to the chair across from his desk, and waited until she was settled before he sat back down. She gave him the envelope. He read everything, the notarial certificate, the will amendment, without speaking. His face was careful the whole time, giving nothing away. When he finished, he set the pages down and looked at her. "The document is formally valid," he said. "Notarized, witnessed, dated. The amendment language is clear." She felt something loosen slightly in her chest. Then he reached under his desk and lifted a second folder onto the surface. It was thick, 3 times the thickness of what she'd brought. He set it down without opening it. "The Hargrove family has already filed a contestation," he said. He opened the folder and turned it to face her, pointing to the date stamp at the top of the first page. She looked at the date. She had still been working at the property then. The envelope had been in the bottom of her drawer, and she had not yet thought to open it. 2 days before she had even touched the envelope, they had already walked into a courthouse and filed papers saying it wasn't hers. They hadn't waited to see what she would do. They already knew what was inside. The folder sat between them on the desk. Whitfield turned to the last section of the Hargrove filing. He pulled out 2 pages, letters she could see, on business letterhead, and slid them across to her. "These were included as exhibits," he said. "Both sent to your address. Do you recognize them?" She looked at the letterhead. Piedmont Land and Property Associates. An address in Richmond. She read the first letter. Formal language, a lot of it, but the substance was simple. They were inquiring on behalf of an interested party regarding a parcel of land in the western section of the county, which she might have an interest in through a family estate connection, and they would welcome the opportunity to discuss a potential purchase. She had received this letter. She remembered it now. She had assumed it was one of those mass-mailed things, targeted broadly, and she had set it aside and then thrown it away because she had no idea what land they were referring to. She read the second one. Same letterhead, same tone, dated 7 months later. She had thrown that one away too. "They sent these to you before filing," Whitfield said. "Twice." She set the letters down on the desk. They had known about the amendment before she did. They had found something, a billing record, an old invoice, something left over from the probate process, that told them a separate document existed. They couldn't find the original because Mr. Hargrove had made sure they couldn't. So they had tried to buy it from her instead, before she understood what she had. When that didn't work, they fired her, and then they filed. The room was quiet, except for the box fan turning slowly on the desk. "There is one other thing," Whitfield said. He flipped to a page near the middle of the folder and read from it in a measured voice, the tone of someone delivering information they wish were different. "James Doyle, the notary who certified the amendment, passed away 3 years ago. His office closed. The records were never properly transferred. He looked up at her. The document you're holding is the only surviving original. That's not an accident. That's why Mr. Hargrove used Doyle specifically. An independent notary, not the family's firm. He made sure the only copy was the one he gave you. Their argument, Whitfield continued, will be that Mr. Hargrove lacked full legal capacity when he signed this, that he was in declining health and subject to undue influence from someone with daily access to the property. He did not say someone like you. He didn't need to. Is that true? Dorothy asked. Was he not capable? Whitfield looked at her steadily. It doesn't matter whether it's true. What matters is whether they can make a judge believe it. A pause. They have 3 physicians ready to testify, and the county judge has handled Hargrove estate matters twice in the last 15 years. Dorothy said nothing. I want to be honest with you, he said. This is winnable, but it won't be easy. He paused. Then, in a different voice, quieter, less professional. For what it's worth, whoever left you that document knew exactly what they were doing. He said it while arranging the pages back into the folder, his eyes on the papers rather than on her face. She drove home the long way, past the grain co-op, past the Methodist cemetery, past the county road that ran beside the Hargrove property. The west field was visible from the road, the same 40 acres she had worked for 22 years without knowing they were already hers. She kept her eyes on the road, but her hands tightened slightly on the wheel. That night she sat at the kitchen table for a long time. She was 65 years old. Her savings would cover the taxes and not much else. A legal fight against the Hargrove family, their lawyers, their doctors, their county judge, was not something she had planned for. She could put it all back in the drawer. No one would blame her. She looked at the amendment for a long time. Then she heard his voice. The garden, the dark, the bourbon he hadn't touched. Especially not them. She picked up her phone, found the number she'd kept written down for years but never used. Eleanor Marsh, Columbia, South Carolina. She dialed. It rang twice. She almost didn't call. What would she even say? I found something, and now I'm in trouble and I don't know why I'm calling you specifically. Eleanor Marsh was not a friend. They had worked on the same property for years without ever being close. The way 2 people can share a space and an employer and a set of unspoken understandings without ever sitting down together for a meal. Polite. Professional. That was all it had been. But she dialed the number anyway. Eleanor picked up on the second ring. Dorothy, she said. Not a question. Just the name stated plainly. The way you say the name of someone you've been expecting. I wasn't sure you'd remember me, Dorothy said, which was a foolish thing to say, and she knew it as soon as it came out. I know why you're calling, Eleanor said. I've been waiting for this call for a while now. Dorothy stood in her kitchen with the phone against her ear and said nothing for a moment. How long? She asked. Since the probate notice ran in the paper, Eleanor said. 8 months ago. I tried to reach you. 3 times. I called the number I had for you, the one I'd always used. The house line, Dorothy said slowly. The Hargrove property. They told me you didn't work there anymore. A pause. I didn't have another number for you. I didn't know how to find you. Dorothy set her hand flat on the kitchen counter and looked at the wall for a moment. 3 calls. Eleanor had tried 3 times, and the family had answered and said the words, and Eleanor had had no way around them. The same family that had fired Dorothy to cut the thread had also been standing at the other end of the line, whenever someone tried to pick it back up. "I have something that belongs to this situation," Eleanor said. "I think you should see it before anything else happens. Can I come up?" She arrived 2 days later on the afternoon bus from Columbia. No specific arrival time given in advance, just a message that morning saying she'd be there before 5. Dorothy was at the station when the bus pulled in. Eleanor Marsh was 68 years old and moved like someone who had learned not to waste motion. She came down the bus steps with a small rolling suitcase in one hand and a cardboard box tucked under her other arm. The box was medium-sized, the kind that copy paper comes in, and it was wrapped around with a length of dark leather cord tied in a simple knot. The cord looked old. The knot looked like it hadn't been touched in years. They stood on the pavement outside the station and looked at each other. No embrace. No, "How have you been?" or "It's so good to see you." Just a moment of recognition between two women who understood the same things without having discussed them. And then Eleanor nodded once and Dorothy nodded back and they walked to the car. That evening they sat at Dorothy's kitchen table with the overhead light on and the window dark behind them. The kettle had boiled. The tea was poured. Eleanor set the cardboard box on the table between them, the leather cord still knotted around it, and put both hands flat on the lid. "He gave me this the same evening he gave you the envelope," she said. "November, 11 years ago. He came into the office. I was still working late, and he set it on my desk and said, 'Eleanor, if they ever contest it, you'll know what to do.'" She looked at the box. "I never opened it. I just kept it." Dorothy looked at the leather cord. It was worn smooth at the knot, the way leather gets when it's been handled often, or when it's been picked up and set back down many times without being undone. "You kept it for 11 years without opening it," Dorothy said. "He asked me to keep it. He didn't ask me to open it." That was Eleanor Marsh, Dorothy thought. 28 years as the private secretary to a difficult man, and she had understood perfectly the difference between what she was asked to do and what she was not. Eleanor untied the cord slowly, looped it to one side, and lifted the lid. Inside was a manila folder, thick with pages. She took it out and set it on the table. "It's a transcript," Eleanor said. "A formal record of a private meeting between Mr. Hargrove and the notary, James Doyle, on November 14th, 11 years ago. The same day the amendment was signed." She touched the edge of the folder but didn't open it. 7 pages, typed, countersigned by both parties. Dorothy reached out and opened the cover. The first page was a formal header: date, location, names of parties present, Doyle's notary certification number. The second page was a statement of purpose. "Mr. Hargrove wishes to establish, for the record, his full legal capacity and voluntary intent in executing the attached amendment." What followed was a transcribed conversation. Questions from Doyle, answers from Mr. Hargrove, the back and forth of a man being asked to prove his own mind was sound. She read through it carefully. He answered every question without hesitation. Dates, property descriptions, his children's names. He stated clearly that no one had pressured him. He sounded, on every page, exactly like the man she had worked for. Precise. Certain. Himself. Then Eleanor said quietly, "Page 7. Dorothy turned to the last page. The format changed slightly near the bottom. A section headed Additional Statement, Voluntary. Below it, a paragraph in the same typed transcript format. Mr. Hargrove's words recorded exactly as spoken. She read it. She read it once. Then she put the page down and looked at Eleanor for a long time. In 22 years, she had never cried in front of a Hargrove or anyone connected to them. She didn't cry now either, but something in her face changed, the way a room changes when someone finally opens a window that's been shut too long. "He said this," she said. It wasn't a question. "In front of the notary," Eleanor said. "On the record. Signed and dated." Dorothy looked back down at the page. Then she closed the folder carefully and set it on the table. The kitchen was quiet. Outside, the wind moved through the yard, through the bare branches of the oak tree at the back of the property. The same kind of wind that moved through the west field this time of year. Cold and steady, coming down from the mountains without asking permission. Eleanor reached for the teapot and refilled both cups without being asked. Neither of them spoke for a moment. Then Dorothy said, "There's something else. Something he left in the envelope with the amendment." She got up and took the small white note card from the counter where she'd left it and set it on the table between them. Eleanor read it. "The survey is already done. The water is real." She nodded slowly, the nod of someone recognizing something they already knew. "He had a geological survey done 8 years ago," Eleanor said. "Independent firm, not one the family used. They found a significant underground water source running through the western section of the property." She set the card down. "He never told his children. He told me because he needed someone to know." A pause. "He said that land wasn't allowed to fall into the hands of someone who would just sell it off." Dorothy looked at the note card, the letters from Piedmont, the 2 attempts to buy the land before she knew she owned it, the filing 2 days before she opened the envelope. "They knew about the water," Dorothy said. "Old paperwork has a way of surfacing," Eleanor said. Dorothy looked at the closed folder on the table. 7 pages. A man sitting across from a notary 11 years ago, answering questions about his own mind, and then at the end saying one more thing, the thing on page 7, that he had apparently decided needed to be on the record. She called Whitfield that evening. He picked up on the 3rd ring, and when she told him what Eleanor had brought, there was a pause on the line, and then he said, "Mrs. Haynes, I need you to bring that transcript to my office first thing tomorrow morning." His voice, she noticed, sounded different than it had the first time she'd sat across from his desk. Less careful, more certain. Dorothy set the transcript down slowly. Outside, the wind moved through the garden, the same kind of wind that had been moving through that west field for 40 years, long before any of this had a name. "He wrote that," she said. It wasn't a question. Eleanor nodded once. "He wrote that." The courtroom smelled like old wood and floor wax. Dorothy had cleaned rooms that smelled exactly like this for 22 years. She sat down in the hard chair behind the plaintiff's table and folded her hands in her lap and waited. The hearing was set for 9 o'clock. She had been up since 4:30. Before Eleanor came downstairs, before the coffee finished brewing, Dorothy had gone out to the backyard in the gray early light and watered the garden. The ground didn't need it. March was wet enough. Her hands needed something to do. She moved through the rows the way she always had, slow and steady, the hose running in a low arc from plant to plant. And when she was done, she coiled it back on the hook by the fence and went inside and washed her hands at the kitchen sink. She wore the navy dress she kept for church. Not to make an impression. It was simply the one garment she owned in which she felt entirely herself. Not dressed up, not dressed down, just present. Eleanor had looked at her when she came downstairs and said nothing, which was the right thing to say. They drove to the courthouse without talking much. The Hargrove family's attorney was a man named Gerald Foss, 60, silver-haired, the kind of careful dresser who wore his confidence in his posture rather than his voice. He had represented the family for 20 years. Dorothy had seen him at the property once or twice over the years, arriving in a dark car, leaving with a briefcase. He had never learned her name. He began at 9:15. His argument was organized and unhurried. Robert Hargrove, he explained, had been in declining health in the years preceding his death. He had reduced his public activities. His children had noted changes in his judgment and decision-making. The amendment in question had been executed during this period, privately, without the knowledge of the family, through a notary who was no longer available to provide testimony, in favor of a household employee with daily unsupervised access to the property and to Mr. Hargrove personally. Foss called 3 physicians. Each one spoke about cognitive decline in careful clinical language, gradual onset, diminished capacity, observable patterns. Each one had records. Each one was credible. Whitfield cross-examined all 3. He was not careless. But Dorothy watched Judge Calloway's pen moving and understood what she was watching. During the morning recess, Whitfield found her in the hallway. "They're making ground on the capacity argument," he said quietly. "The medical documentation is more detailed than I anticipated." He kept his voice level, the voice of someone reporting rather than alarming. "We need Eleanor on first thing after the break. The transcript has to come in before Foss has a chance to reinforce the narrative." Dorothy nodded. "How are you doing?" he asked. "Fine," she said. He looked at her for a moment, then nodded and went back toward the courtroom. The afternoon session opened with Eleanor Marsh. She walked to the witness stand the way she did everything, without hurry, without performance. She was 68 years old, and she had spent 28 years in rooms where powerful people made decisions and expected the people around them to be invisible. She sat down, adjusted the microphone, and folded her hands on the rail in front of her. Whitfield took her through it methodically. Her name, her position. 28 years as private secretary to Robert Hargrove, managing his correspondence, his appointments, his personal files, his household accounts. Her retirement 3 years prior. The date of the evening in question, November 14th, 11 years ago. "Can you describe what Mr. Hargrove gave you that evening?" Whitfield asked. "A sealed cardboard box," Eleanor said. "He brought it to my office at the end of the day. He told me to keep it somewhere safe and not to discuss it with anyone." "Did he say anything else?" Eleanor paused, not from uncertainty, but from precision, making sure she had the phrasing right. "He said, 'Eleanor, if they ever contest it, you'll know what to do.' And did you open the box?" "No." "In 11 years?" "No. He asked me to keep it. He didn't ask me to open it." Foss objected twice during Eleanor's testimony. Relevance, then foundation. Both times Judge Calloway overruled and waved it forward. The courtroom was small enough that you could hear the quality of the silence between the exchanges. Whitfield moved to enter the transcript into evidence. Foss objected on authentication grounds. There was a 10-minute exchange between the attorneys and the judge, voices low and procedural, while Dorothy sat with her hands in her lap and looked at the table in front of her and waited. The transcript was admitted. Whitfield asked Eleanor to read from page 7. Eleanor opened the folder to the last page. She found the section marked Additional Statement, Voluntary. She read it the way she had done everything that afternoon, without theater, without emphasis, in the plain, measured voice of a woman reporting what was on the page. Mrs. Haynes has never asked me for a single thing in 22 years. That is the only reason I want to give her something. The room was quiet. Dorothy looked straight ahead. She had read those words on the page in her kitchen 4 nights ago. She had held them in silence while Eleanor watched and did not ask. She had carried them into this building and into this room and sat with them through 3 physicians and a morning recess and Whitfield's careful afternoon. And now they were in the air, in the room, on the record. Not hers alone anymore. She had spent 22 years being invisible in that house. And the man who owned it had written down, in front of a notary, in a document designed to survive him, exactly what he had seen. No one spoke for a moment. Not the judge. Not Foss. Not anyone in the gallery behind her. From somewhere in the rows of seats, there was the small sound of a pencil set down on a wooden surface. Then stillness. 3 seconds. 5. Then Judge Calloway cleared his throat and said, "Mr. Foss, redirect." Foss stood. He returned to the core of the argument, that a man in declining health, increasingly isolated from his family, had been guided toward a decision that served the interests of someone with daily access and no formal accountability. He said it as someone who believed it. They were competent arguments, but the words were already in the room, spoken in a plain voice, heard by everyone present. No subsequent argument could unspeak them. Whitfield's closing was brief. The document was valid. The notary was independent. The transcript established capacity and voluntary intent beyond what 3 medical opinions about general patterns could contradict. And the statement on page 7, "The only reason I want to give her something," was not the language of a man being manipulated. It was the language of a man who had made up his mind. "The transcript made it hard to rule otherwise," Whitfield said simply. Judge Calloway recessed for deliberation at 2:40. He returned at 3:55. The ruling was brief. The amendment was valid. The property transfer would stand. Whitfield shook her hand twice, which was one more time than she expected. Eleanor touched her arm once lightly, the way you touch someone when words would get in the way. Dorothy thanked them both. She meant it. Then she walked out of the courthouse into the late afternoon light, alone, the way she had walked into most things in her life. The air outside was cold and smelled like rain coming in from the west. She stood on the courthouse steps for a moment, her coat buttoned, her hands at her sides. People moved past her on the sidewalk. Courthouse business, ordinary afternoon, nothing particular happening. She walked to her car, sat for a moment before starting the engine. 22 years. A room that smelled like floor wax. One sentence, spoken into a record, by a man who had wanted it to survive him. She started the car. It felt right. The Hargroves did not apologize. Nobody who knew them expected them to. Richard Hargrove, the eldest son, the one who had filed the contestation, the one who had sent the letters through Piedmont Land and Property, continued his life in the way that men with old names and deep roots continue their lives when they lose something they wanted, but didn't strictly need. He appeared at the County Planning Commission meeting the following Tuesday. He played golf at the club on Saturday morning. He attended the 11 o'clock service at First Presbyterian, the way he had attended it for 40 years, and he shook hands in the narthex afterward and accepted condolences about his father from people who offered them, and he drove home in the same car he had always driven. Dorothy knew this because small counties are small, and people talk, and she had lived here long enough to hear things without asking. She did not spend time thinking about Richard Hargrove. She had her own work to do. It was not that week, and not the week after. But Dorothy began to notice things. The County Planning Commission held its spring appointments in April. Richard Hargrove's name had been on the nominations list for the Infrastructure Subcommittee, a seat he had held or been considered for, in some form or another, for 15 years. This time, when the appointments were announced, his name was not among them. The clerk's office, when asked, said only that the position had already been filled. No explanation, no public statement. The position had been filled. At church, Dorothy heard this from a woman she had known for 30 years, said quietly over coffee after the service. People still greeted Richard in the narthex, still shook his hand, still said the appropriate things in the appropriate tones. But for 3 Sundays in a row, the pew section where he typically sat had empty seats on either side of him that filled in everywhere else and somehow not there. No one said anything. No one needed to. That was how this county worked. It did not march. It did not petition. It did not hold meetings or write letters to the editor. It simply adjusted, quietly and without announcement, the way a river adjusts around a rock. Not dramatically, not with noise, just permanently. Dorothy had lived here long enough to know that this form of turning away, once begun, did not reverse. She did not feel satisfaction exactly. It was something quieter than that. The recognition that the world had noticed something, and that noticing had consequences, and that she had not needed to be the one to make it happen. She had gone home the afternoon of the ruling and changed out of the navy dress and gone directly to the backyard. The garden didn't need much. The early spring planting was already in. She had put in the cool weather crops 2 weeks before, peas and lettuce and the first of the kale, and the beds were clean and the paths were clear. There was nothing that actually needed doing. She pulled weeds anyway. She worked her way along the near border first, then the far one, on her knees in the soft soil, her hands moving through the dirt with the automatic knowledge of someone who had been doing this since she was a girl. The weeds were small and came out easily, and she dropped them into the bucket beside her without looking. She staked 2 tomato plants that were doing perfectly fine on their own. She turned the compost at the back corner, which also didn't need turning. She worked until her knees told her to stop, and then she worked a little longer. The light was almost gone when she finally stood up. She brushed the soil from her palms, picked up the bucket, and carried it to the compost pile. Her back ached in the specific way that comes from bending over for too long, the kind of ache that would be there in the morning and then gone by noon. She was walking back toward the house when her phone rang. She recognized the number. She almost let it go to voicemail. "Mom." Her son's voice. Gary. He lived in Roanoke now, had for 12 years. They spoke at Christmas and sometimes in between, when one of them thought of it. "I heard what happened," he said. "A cousin called me, said it was in the county paper." "All right," Dorothy said. That's a big deal. 40 acres. A pause. "Do you need help? With managing it, I mean. I know some people who work in property management. If you need someone to—" "Thank you, Gary," she said. She heard him start to say something else. "I'm fine," she said. "I'll talk to you soon." She ended the call. She stood at the back door for a moment, the phone in one hand and the trowel in the other, looking out at the garden in the near dark. The beds were quiet. The staked tomatoes held their shape against the last of the light. Somewhere in the yard, something small moved through the leaf litter at the fence line and was still again. She set the trowel on the porch rail and went inside. Her hands were dirty. Her back was stiff. She washed up at the kitchen sink, dried her hands on the dish towel, and stood for a moment in the quiet kitchen. For the first time in months, she felt exactly like herself. Spring came late that year. Dorothy didn't mind. She had learned somewhere in the past several months that the things worth having were usually the things that made you wait. The deed transfer was finalized on a Wednesday in early April. Whitfield called her at 8 in the morning to tell her, and she thanked him and set the phone down and stood in the kitchen for a moment. Then she drove out to the west field. She parked at the edge of the old fence line and walked in through the gap where the gate had rusted off its post years ago. She had meant to fix it, back when it wasn't her gate to fix. The ground was soft from the week's rain. The field smelled like wet soil and the particular green of things coming back after cold. She walked out to the middle of it and stopped. The land looked the same as it always had. Same old rows, same volunteer plants pushing up along the southern edge. Same spring running shallow along the northern border where the soil changed color. She knew every foot of it. She had known it for 22 years, but the feeling under her boots was different. She stood there for a long time without doing anything. Just stood. Let the field be what it was, and let herself be what she was in it. Not the woman who came to tend it, not the woman who had worked it for someone else's name. Just a woman standing on her own ground in the early spring, with mud on her shoes and nowhere particular to be. She met with Whitfield the following week to go over the practical questions. He had a yellow legal pad and a list. They worked through it: property taxes, maintenance costs, insurance, the question of what she intended to do with the land in the long term. There's also the water rights question, he said. The Geological Survey establishes significant groundwater under the western section. The county has been looking at water access options for that part of the district for several years. If you were open to it, a usage rights agreement, not a sale, just usage rights, would generate enough income to cover your costs and then some. You'd keep full ownership of the land. Dorothy looked at the legal pad. The water. The same water that had been the reason for the letters, the filing, the 8 months of maneuvering. The thing the Hargrove family had tried to keep, through her, without her knowing. What would the county do with it? She asked. Public supply, Whitfield said. The whole western district. She thought about that for a moment. Then she said, I'll sign the usage agreement, but I have one condition. He looked up. The land stays open, she said. No fencing, no access restrictions. Anyone in the county can come onto the property. He wrote that down. And the formal name for the property? For the county records. Dorothy looked out the window at the parking lot below, at the gray April sky above the buildings. The Hargrove Garden, she said. Whitfield's pen stopped. He looked up at her. She met his eyes without explaining herself for a moment. Then she said, He believed in me first. The name belongs to him, not to them. Whitfield looked at her for another moment. Then he wrote it down, slowly and carefully, the way you write something you want to get exactly right. He didn't say anything else. Neither did she. He went back to the legal pad, and they finished the rest of the list. The sign went up in late June. A simple wooden board, hand-lettered, mounted on 2 posts at the entrance where the old gate had been. The Hargrove Garden, open to all. The paint was still faintly tacky when Dorothy ran her finger along the edge of it that first morning. She left a small smudge and didn't fix it. There was time. By midsummer, she had planted the east section in cutting flowers and the west section in kitchen herbs, with a long border of lavender running between them that she intended eventually to extend all the way to the tree line. She had repaired the fence along the north boundary and cleared the path to the spring so people could reach it without fighting through the brush. She had built 2 benches from salvaged lumber and set them at either end of the main path, in the spots where the light was best in the late afternoon. People came. Not many, at first. A few neighbors, a woman who asked if she could cut flowers for her daughter's wedding, 2 older men who turned out to be brothers and who stood at the edge of the lavender for a long time without saying much. Dorothy let them all in without ceremony. That was the point. Eleanor had called the week before from Columbia. The bus had been on time. She'd gotten home safely. She hoped the lavender border would be finished before frost. They talked for 20 minutes, longer than they ever had before. When Dorothy set the phone down, she sat by the window for a moment. The kind of friendship that arrives late in life, without history, without ceremony, and turns out to be exactly what was needed. She didn't have a word for it. That was fine. On a Thursday afternoon in late August, a car pulled up at the entrance and parked on the grass verge. Dorothy was working near the herb border when she heard it. She recognized the car, her daughter's. She stayed where she was and watched. The driver's door opened. Linda got out, and then the passenger door, and a small figure in a yellow shirt came out of the back seat at a run. Emma, 9 years old. Dorothy's only grandchild, whom she had seen 4 times in the past 3 years. Linda stood at the entrance for a moment, one hand on the car door, looking at the sign. Then she looked across the field at Dorothy. She raised a hand, not quite a wave, something smaller than that, an acknowledgement. Then she got back in the car and drove away. Dorothy watched the car until it was gone. Then she looked at Emma, who was already halfway down the main path with her arms out to her sides, turning in a slow circle. "What's this one called?" Emma shouted, pointing at something low and purple along the border. "Come here and I'll show you," Dorothy said. They spent the rest of the afternoon in the garden. Emma moved the way children move in open spaces, quickly, then completely still, then quickly again, and she asked the name of everything she saw. Dorothy followed at her own pace, naming what was asked. Lavender. Emma repeated it carefully. Got it right. Yarrow. Emma frowned at the white clusters. Yarrow, she said. Then, sparrow? Yarrow, Dorothy said. Emma nodded seriously and moved on to the next thing. They walked the whole length of the main path. They stopped at the spring, and Emma crouched down and put her hand in the water, which was cold enough to make her pull it back and laugh. They sat on the bench at the far end and looked back the way they had come. The long rows, the lavender border, the sign at the entrance catching the last of the afternoon light. The paint on the sign had dried by now, but Dorothy noticed in the low sun that you could still see the slight sheen of it, still just a little brighter than the wood around it. New enough that it hadn't weathered yet into the landscape. New enough that it was still becoming what it was going to be. Hargrove, Emma said, reading the sign from across the field. Is that the family you worked for? It is, Dorothy said. Why did you name it after them? Dorothy looked out over the garden, the lavender moving slightly in the evening air, the yarrow standing white and still, the spring running along the far edge, the same spring that had run there before she came and would run there after. Because the man who owned this land believed in me before I had a reason to believe in myself, she said. And I want to remember that. Emma considered this with the seriousness of a 9-year-old receiving information that is slightly too large for immediate understanding. Then she nodded once, the way children nod when they are filing something away for later. What's that one called? She said, pointing at something yellow near the fence line. Black-eyed Susan, Dorothy said. Black-eyed Susan, Emma repeated. She got it right. The sun was almost down. The sign at the entrance still held the faint smell of paint if you stood close enough. There was more work to do tomorrow, and the week after that. The fall planting, the lavender extension, the bench at the north end that still needed its second coat. Emma looked back at the lavender border and tried the word again, quietly, to herself. Yarrow, she said. Then, sparrow. She looked up at Dorothy with a small, uncertain smile. Dorothy looked at her granddaughter. This child she barely knew, standing in the middle of a field that had taken 65 years and 22 of service and one sealed envelope to arrive at, and felt something settle in her chest that had not been settled in a long time. She crouched down beside Emma, the way her knees allowed her to these days, slowly and with intention, and pointed at the yarrow nearest them. White clusters, flat-topped, the kind that came back every year without being asked. Say it again, she said. Emma looked at the flower, took her time. Yarrow, she said. She got it right. Dorothy smiled. Not the kind of smile that needed to be explained or reported. Just a smile, in a garden, in the late afternoon, with a child who was learning the names of things. Some things take a lifetime to be spoken aloud. But when they finally are, they stay. If this story stayed with you, we'd love to hear from you in the comments. Has there ever been someone in your life who believed in you quietly before you believed in yourself? Tell us about them. And if you'd like more stories like this one, subscribe so you don't miss the next.